Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming along to our physical health session today. We have a really great group of speakers to share their research with you today. I will now be passing over to our pre-recorded lived experience person today who will help situate the session in the topics and experiences of autistic people, which means I've got to do a screen share, and that could be a little bit tricky.
Hi there, I'm Sarah. I'm a late diagnosed autistic cis woman, and now age 51, I am menopausing, which for myself and many others is proving to be physically as well as mentally the most challenging lifespan change so far. Davina McCall's t-shirt design pretty much sums up the physical symptoms of anxiety, depression, anger, forgetfulness, hot flushes, tiredness, which are common experiences for menopausal women, and they can be devastating. However, for an autistic person who has already got decades of living with the physical effects of being autistic in an unfriendly world, the menopausal experience can be off the scale. But until the magnificent Rachel Mosley did her groundbreaking study investigating this, there was nothing out there about us. I am very proud to have been one of the 7 women who were part of that focus group for this menopause study, which is actually subtitled When My Autism Broke. Now, Rachel says, autistic women are vulnerable. We're already vulnerable to suicide, poor physical and mental health, and because they may already struggle with planning and controlling their emotions and coping with change, the menopause may be an especially challenging time. And she also adds that support needs of the ageing autistic population are currently unmet and should be a vital goal for future research. I can't argue with any of that. I already struggled with the physical effects of poor mental health, sleep issues, IBS, proprioception, sensory differences, executive function fails, and the multi-systemic effects of ME. The hormonal changes, however, have wreaked havoc on my already challenged system and have exacerbated all of my existing symptoms. And it has resulted in me having an ME surge and being unable to work for the last 7 months. In addition, my neurodivergence has shifted, and the ADHD, which I now realise is always there, has come of age and is jostling with my autism for the little attention I now have. Calling the menopause a change has got to be the understatement of the century. However, I do think there is hope. I am using this time to reassess my life, focus on my well-being, and plan for a fulfilling future. This has broken me, but I am rebuilding. There are autistic-led support groups, and for me, the saviour that is sertraline and the promise of ADHD meds. And most importantly, researchers are taking up Rachel's gauntlet and planning more studies that will build on her excellent work. Thank you for listening.
Now, I hope you'll agree with me that Sarah Douglas's introduction to this session is incredibly strong and impactful, not least because her experiences will likely resonate with many others, even if it's not an autistic woman, but an autistic man or child. There are so many experiences of physical health that impact the daily lives of autistic people. Our first speaker today is Daniel Poole. He'll be exploring a bit more about time and autism. And I'm just waiting for Daniel to come back on screen. There
Hello.
we go.
Good morning. Okay, shall I share screen? Oops. Okay. Right then, thanks very much for having me on this panel today. So I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing during my postdoc, my current postdoc, in which I'm looking at time and timing perception in autism. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about timing and time? So cognitive psychologists more broadly, have a wide range of different mental processes that they're talking about when they're talking about time and timing. So a non-exhaustive list, but some of the things that will be important in what I'm going to be talking about now are the how we perceive and understand duration. So this is the kind of thing that's important when we do activities like crossing the road. We go and press the button and we have a sense of how long it takes for the green man to appear before we can cross. We also have a sense of how long that particular duration and how that compares to other crossings we've been at in the past. We also have what's called relative timing. This is how we perceive order and synchrony in our incoming sensory signals. And what might be referred to as temporal cognition, how we think about time, how we understand, situate ourselves in relation to the past and think about the future. So why am I looking at this in the context of autism? So there's been many reports from autistic people that something related to time might be impacted. And there's been this work over the past 10 years, which a so-called temporal deficit hypothesis has been put forward. This is by Melissa Ullman and colleagues. So the idea here is that as a result of reduced connectivity, and particularly in this brain region called the striatum, that this has some impact on our internal clock, our internal sense of the passage of time. This then leads to an impact on how autistic people perceive and process time and duration. And then the idea is that this will then play some role in impacting other more complex elements of cognition and behavior. Now, in the context of physical health, this could be behaviors such as remembering to take medication at a particular time, at a particular point in the day, or thinking about sort of future, situating our current behaviors to prepare us for the future. So things like being able to exercise at particular points, making time for these kinds of behaviors. So there is some evidence in support of this notion. So in some recently published study, we found that parents of autistic children talked about how their children's concept of time and capacity to think about the future, so prospection, seemed to be impacted and had a quite considerable impact on their child's sense of well-being. There's also experimental work looking at duration perception and has found that, that performance is reduced in autistic participants in comparison to non-autistic neurotypical participants. So we did a systematic review on this work. So a systematic review is where you look out there, you look at the entire research literature, try and bring it all together and synthesize it to make sense of the current state of evidence. We found, and in keeping with what I mentioned in the first slide, that there was really a wide variety of different approaches that researchers had been using to try and understand time and timing in autism. And as such, the evidence base is actually pretty mixed. There are a number of studies that do suggest that timing might be reduced in autistic people, but also many studies showing no difference between autistic and neurotypicals, and studies as well showing that autistic people perform superior to neurotypicals on many tasks. Something that emerged as an interesting possible finding is that there's some interaction of time and duration perception with individuals' memory. And I'll talk about that a bit more later. So in the work that I'm presenting today, I wanted to look at this in a little bit more depth. So we work with 57 autistic adults and 91 non-autistic neurotypical control participants. These are adults aged between 18 and 45. And the participants came into the lab, this was all pre-COVID, and completed a selection of different timing tasks involving judgments about beeps and flashes, all at the sort of millisecond level, and also completed questionnaires about their daily experiences around time. So the overarching aim of this work was to try and get a better sense, try and get a superior understanding of timing and how this differs, if at all, between autistic and non-autistic. We had a couple of different expectations about what performance could look like. So if this temporal deficit hypothesis is accurate, you would expect to see that autistic people would be universally show lower performance in all its tasks. However, we didn't really expect that this was likely. This might relate to sensory processing, and you might see differences depending on whether timing involved auditory or visual stimuli, as other researchers have recently suggested. Or coming off our study, it might be of our systematic review. It might relate to whether the timing tasks actually involved some memory component, if it involved also remembering elements of time. So what I'll do now is talk you through each of these tasks in turn and describe the results with them, because it's quite complicated, a few different tasks. So the first experiment looked at the perception of duration. Here we presented participants with two durations back to back and simply asked them which of the two was longer. We then adjusted those durations until they could just about detect a difference between them, and this is an estimate of their threshold. So if lower your threshold is, the more precise you are in making these kinds of judgments. And we were comparing the autistic and neurotypical groups. So these figures here, these are called rain cloud plots. If you've not seen them before, what we're really looking at is the extent to which the bulb of these distributions overlap. And what we found here, there was no differences between the autistic and neurotypicals on either of our duration perception tasks. We also looked at relative timing. In this task, the participant was presented with two stimuli, very quick succession, and asked which one of these came first. We then, again, manipulated the timing between them to determine the participant's threshold. Lower thresholds means they're better at it. And again, we observed no differences on this task between the groups. So the next task, in this task, we're testing this internal clock. So we presented participants with a duration and simply asked them, so how long was that? And we calculated a measure here called the slope. And a slope of 1 would mean that you're performing completely perfectly on this task. Importantly here, there were no differences between how our autistic and neurotypical participants performed. Now, for our final experimental task, we involved the memory component as well. So the participant was given the duration. They were asked to try and retain this in memory, try and remember how long this is. And then we presented them with a sequence of other durations, and they were asked on each trial, was that the same as the one that you remembered previously? And what we found, it's not super clear here because we had a number of different conditions. So increased A prime means the participant is doing better. Overall, the autistic participants were less effective on this task involving this memory component when they're being asked to remember at time. Now, the final element of our test of timing in this study was some questionnaires about timing in everyday life. So we had two different questionnaires we used. There's the It's About Time questionnaire. This measures time concept, and I'll talk a little bit more about what these measures really mean in a second. So lower scores on this questionnaire reflect reduced time concept, and the autistic group produced lower scores of time concept compared to neurotypicals. On the other hand, this measure time structure, the autistic group actually produced higher scores than the neurotypical group. So importantly, what we're seeing here, there are differences in relation to timing in everyday life, rather than they're reflecting some deficits in timing, as was previously suggested. So just to summarize this, overall, our study doesn't support this temporal deficit hypothesis of autism as has currently been described. This is because across these different tasks, we found no differences between groups on most of these basic timing tasks. However, observing this difference, as with some of the previous work involving time and memory, we think that this might reflect differences in how autistic people and neurotypicals encode and then retrieve duration in memory. So as I mentioned before, we saw these differences on these questionnaires, and just to try and unpick this with a little bit about what these questionnaires are measuring, the time concept, this really reflects a sort of people reporting a reduced understanding around some elements of how time functions, but most importantly, really about time management, around meeting deadlines, around being ready for things on time. Whereas on the other hand, autistic participants were reporting increased time structure. So this is a sort of sense of purposiveness in how you use your time, and how you extract meaning from the activities you do in the day. So when we look at this in future and future work, might consider whether we've looked at adults here, and we might want to try and understand a bit more whether autistic children, how they perform with timing tasks in neurotypicals, differences in working memory and attention, develop across development, and we want to try and better understand, make this be important in differences between autistic children and adults' timing. And also, of course, with these tasks that I've described here, these are sort of low-level fundamental building blocks of time, and what we've asked people to do are making these sort of explicit judgments. But timing's really important in a range of more complicated behaviours, and it'd be really important to try and tease that apart a little bit more as well, and understand timing's role there. Okay, so before I finish, I just want to highlight, if you're interested in this topic, we are running an event on this next week, looking at this in a bit more depth, and hopefully someone can share the ticket link for me in the chat. And I just want to finally say thank you both to the study team who I worked on this, the Autism at Manchester expert group who helped us in designing and interpreting the findings of these studies, and of course to all the study participants. And also thank you to you all for listening.
Thank you for that, Daniel. It's really kind of made me question how time is thought of in autism, particularly because extra time is often seen as a reasonable adjustment, but I don't know why. It's just extra time, but I guess maybe it's not as useful as people think, or there needs to be more research into what that extra time is used for. Do remember to pop your questions in the Q&A button for Daniel. We'll be answering those after the next two speakers have spoken. Up next, we have Keren MacLennan, who is talking about a piece of sensory research, and her presentation is titled, "In Our Own Words, the Complex Sensory Experiences of Autistic Adults."
Thanks, Sarah. Let me just get my screen up. Perfect. Yeah, so hi, I'm Keren, and I am just finishing my PhD at the University of Reading. And this study I'm going to talk about was part of my PhD, and it's entitled In Our Own Words, the Complex Sensory Experiences of Autistic Adults, which was an online mixed methods study. So first, I'd like to mention the collaborators on this project. So Teresa Tavasoli is the PI, and she's also my PhD supervisor. And also Sarah was involved in this project, which was wonderful. And we're very excited to say that actually it was published 2 days ago. So that will be included in the chat, so you can go and read, because it's quite a complex study and I'm trying to summarize it as best I can in this talk. So first of all, I think it's important to kind of define what I mean by sensory reactivity differences as part of this talk. So firstly, there's sensory hyperreactivity. So you might have a stronger response or be more sensitive to sensory input, such as finding like sounds overwhelming, or there's hyporeactivity, which is you might be less responsive or may not notice sensory input, such as maybe not noticing pain. or sensory seeking, and that might be that you are fascinated by or get fixated on certain sensory input, such as looking at light. So sensory reactivity differences are thought to be present in around 94% of autistic adults, and are part of the DSM diagnostic criteria for autism under restricted and repetitive behaviours. And people can present with a mixed pattern across domains. And by domains, we mean like vision, or, auditory, touch. And that can also vary depending on situations and contexts. And although some sensory experiences can be enjoyable, so sensory seeking might be soothing or might reduce distress, some experiences can be quite distressing, and sensory hyperreactivity has been linked to mental health conditions, and also has been thought to be a barrier to accessing public spaces. But there was some gaps in the research. Sensory hyperactivity is most commonly researched, and that's especially in children. But in autistic adults, we kind of know less about the experiences of especially sensory hyperreactivity, and seeking has very rarely been looked at. And this is also the experiences of these across the different domains. And also existing qualitative research has not included stakeholders in the research process. So therefore, we conducted this study that aimed to elucidate the complex sensory experiences of autistic adults. And this was done in different ways. So firstly, we wanted to identify different types of sensory input that related to sensory reactivity differences and across domains. And the domains we looked at for this was tactile, so touch, sound, vision, taste, smell, and interoception, which is kind of noticing those internal body clues. And the second aim was to understand more about autistic adult sensory experiences in general relating to those sensory differences, and to then develop a theoretical model that reflected these experiences. And importantly, we wanted it all to be shaped, this project to be shaped by autistic individuals, so that it was kind of relevant and consistent with their experiences and values as an autistic researcher. And we did this by using an online survey, which we felt was a kind of a good way that participants could say what was important to them using their own language and their own terminology. And using an online approach also means that you can get a diverse range of voices from different locations, so using like a wide angle lens. And this also meant that people could do it at their own time and in their own space, and they didn't have to come in to speak in front of loads of people. And it was a mixed method study, as mentioned. So there was multiple choice questions to identify types of sensory stimuli that people might be sensory, have sensory differences to. And this was so if people would struggle with the open questions, they could still participate. And then there was 28 open questions. So there were starting questions, which were more broad, and then people could give much more detailed information if they wanted to. And we used this participatory framework to make sure that autistic people were involved and informed the research design. And so we managed to recruit 49 autistic adults to take part and have their data used, and they were aged between 20 and 55 years, although not everyone disclosed their age. The sample were predominantly female and predominantly white, and they reported to have a range of co-occurring conditions, the most common being anxiety, but also around 29% said that they didn't have any co-occurring conditions to being autistic. And so we had 83 participants originally sign up and provide the demographic information, but then they did not complete any further questions. So we had 49 people completed the initial 4 open questions, which were asking generally about people's experiences of being sensory hyperreactive, seeking, or neutral to the sensory environment. Then 40 completed the multiple choice questions to identify whether they had sensory differences to predefined sensory input. And then we had 29 people who then completed the more comprehensive additional open questions, which was asking more about sensory differences within each domain, as mentioned before. So firstly, we conducted a quantitative analysis looking at those multiple choice questions, and that looks at the percentage of our participants that endorsed having sensory differences overall, and to the different sensory stimuli. Overall, our participants, 94% of the participants said that they were sensory hyperreactive, 29 said they were sensory hyporeactive, and 41% said they were sensory seeking. But we also looked at how, like, the overlaps within that. And interestingly, the autistic adults most commonly said they experience overlapping sensory hyperreactivity and sensory seeking, and they're least commonly experienced overlapping sensory hyperreactivity and sensory seeking. And this is a lot of information, but I will just quickly summarize it. So this showed that they identified to be sensory hyperreactive to a range of different stimuli across domains, but less so in sensory hyporeactivity, which was mainly linked to interoception. But there were also a lot of neutral experiences, so things that weren't found to be I particularly liked or disliked or not noticed. And there was also a range of sensory seeking. So the next stage was that we did a content analysis on the qualitative data, the open questions. And this is a way of classifying meaning to create categories. And we looked at the number of participants that reported sensory input related to these sensory differences across domains, which was kind of similar to the quantitative analysis. And this showed a little bit more insight into where those kinds of individual differences might lay. And there was a lot of kind of commonalities in sensory hyperreactivity, but actually the highest spoken about one was being hyperreactive to strong odors. Again, interoception was most commonly talked about related to sensory hyporeactivity, but also people talked about not noticing sounds when distracted or focused, and also being struggling with kind of visual search. There's some processing things in there as well. And as for sensory seeking, there was a range of really individually reported input that people would seek out, but the most common one was music, closely followed by pressure, such as tight clothing and tight hugs. So then we did a somatic analysis where we were able to look at trends in the data and look at themes and sub-themes. And we used an iterative framework, which meant that you could take into account kind of our own bias and what we wanted to find out, and then question that and think about actually what the data was telling us. And this allowed us to revise and refine the themes based on feedback from the research team, as well as with speaking with autistic adults so they could inform the findings. And the main themes that we found were related to outcomes, control, tolerance and management, and the role of other people. And there were sub-themes within that. But from this, we created a model of sensory reactivity differences. So rather than talking through the themes, I'll talk about them in relation to the model. Okay, so this was the model that we created, and this shows that responses, so reactivity, sensory differences to sensory input, has a range of different outcomes, which are both immediate and long-term. But these can be mediated, meaning that they might mediate those outcomes. And there were moderators, not mediators, moderate those outcomes based on either personal moderators or external moderators. But these outcomes could then also go back and influence an individual's sensory reactivity. So to talk about the outcomes, of these immediate outcomes, this sensory differences could impact on physical discomfort and also lead to overwhelm. So this individual talks about, oh, sorry, got the bar in the way, I can't read it. there we go. They said, I find it difficult to recognize or describe what my pain was. This led to many, oh, sorry, I've gone too far. Sorry. They said, all the loud environmental noise can drive me into a shutdown, and then every sound is utterly overwhelming. But this also leads to, there's also long-term outcomes which are linked to mental health as well as physical health. So they said, I find it difficult to recognize or describe what my pain was. This led to many traumatic medical situations where I couldn't say that I was in pain. As well as this, the personal moderators included level of control, so how much control someone might have over the sensory input, as well as their level of self-control to be able to disengage from the input when needed. So an autistic individual said, I can regularly spend long periods of time in the lighting section of a department store and find it difficult to leave. So there were also linked to personal resources such as current mood or energy levels. So someone said, sometimes if I'm relaxed, if I've slept well and I've had a relaxed day, I can tolerate most noises and lights well. So these would moderate those outcomes. As for the external moderators, one of the things that was commonly talked about was different management strategies. So this included soothing sensory input, and avoidance, as well as making adaptations. So one of the participants said, I seek comfort in small things so that I can filter the sensory environment. It helps distract me from what is happening around me so that I can avoid more intense or unpleasant inputs. And the final moderator was actually the role of other people in kind of moderating those outcomes. So that was either other people providing understanding or other people providing support. And one of the participants said, my boyfriend knows that if I have a meltdown, the best help is to squish me as hard as he can until I feel okay again. So just to summarize, our results suggest that sensory reactivity differences are still prominent in adulthood, and that includes seeking. They're complex and individual in nature, and they are present across a range of modalities. And also our model shows that there's actual mediating again, moderating factors that can alter outcomes, and that can then in turn moderate the experience of sensory input. And so, yeah, I would like to thank my collaborators, as I mentioned, as well as the funders for this project and my PhD MQ in Autistica. And special thanks go to all the autistic adults who are involved in shaping this project and who took part in this research as participants.
Thank you for sharing that, Keren. I know I probably have a bit more insight than the audience as to what went on. But that was kind of incredibly interesting to see how it's all evolved, and the process diagram, I guess it's called, for how sensory inputs and outputs work. Our next speaker is Marianna Karavidas. She is talking about menopause, so covering some of the themes raised by Sarah Douglas in our introduction. And her talk is entitled, It's Not Just in My Head, and It's Not Just Irrelevant, Autistic Negotiations of Menopausal Transitions.
So thank you. Just to let you know a little bit about who I am, I'm Marianna. I was diagnosed with autism at 21, did this piece of research when I was 22 under supervision of Dr. Richard Davissa, and I'm now 24. I've worked with many autistic children and teenagers, but don't have professional or personal experience of menopause, autistic or otherwise. Secondly, I'll be making brief mentions of topics like menstruation, aging, and difficult experiences with professionals, but not in much depth. You're welcome to sort of duck out of this talk if you think it might make you uncomfortable. Oh, sorry, didn't put the slide show on. Yeah, so the definition of menopause I went with is the time when someone assigned female at birth stops having periods and is no longer able to get pregnant without medical help. This happens around the age of 51 in the UK, but there's a big range to that. And some people have it brought on earlier as a result of things like gender affirming treatments or like chemotherapy. Perimenopause is the time, often months leading up to menopause, when many people have a lot of physical and mental changes that can often be really uncomfortable. These include things like low mood, hot flushes, so getting very warm all of a sudden, and like brain fog, temporarily not being able to think clearly, among other things. Late recognition of autism amongst people assigned female at birth means that many need to adapt to that kind of component of their identity around the time when they also might need to adapt to menopause. And until recently, as Sarah said, there wasn't much research into the overlap between autism and menopause. But Rachel Mosley and colleagues at Bournemouth University published 2 really fabulous papers in 2020, and I'd highly recommend those. Um, so we know that risks of experiencing both mental and physical health issues can increase during menopause. And similarly, conferences such as this show us just how many threats to well-being there are to us as autistic people. Um, so both autism and menopause are absolutely real things. And during menopause, hormones in the body do all sorts. There are changes, for example, like not bleeding, and we don't know exactly what causes autism. But I certainly feel that there's certainly something setting my brain apart. However, I refuse to believe that there's anything inherently wrong with me. I'm not ill because I'm autistic. And I think there's a really complex array of things that influence my ability to survive and thrive. Factors like stigma and misunderstandings don't help. Similarly, not everyone views menopause as inherently awful, but it's a stage of life with good, bad, and neutral aspects. And we know that actually the place that we're born affects how people experience menopause. So, for example, a study by Syacott et al. Found that women have reported frequent hot flushes and subsequent embarrassment and more menopause-related health concerns in cultures that position menopause as a negative medical issue relative to people to places where it's viewed as a more positive life stage. This doesn't mean that suffering experienced around menopause is any less real or made up or anything like that. But I think, autistic people, menopausal people deserve to have any suffering they're going through understood in context. I thought about this topic using what's called a material, discursive, and psychic approach. This basically means that physical, cultural, and psychological factors all interact. I really like flowcharts, and so I kind of wanted to show you the sort of thing that I sketched out, kind of which aided my reflections when I was carrying out the study. So what did I do? I couldn't have asked for more thoughtful, intelligent, and funny interviewees, and without them, there would have been no research. I'm eternally grateful to them. So I did semi-structured interviews. All my participants were between the ages of 39 and 63 and were either peri or postmenopausal. Most had a professional autism diagnosis, but one self-identified and was waiting assessment. And my participants either used she, her, or they, them pronouns. My research questions were: how do autistic people discursively construct their experiences of menopause change, which basically means that I focused a lot on language, and what are the implications of these constructions for well-being, identity, and accessing support? So I presented sort of 3 themes that emerged, and also some kind of abbreviated quotes from participants. I'm a bit of a quote hoarder, so I apologize, these are a little bit wordy in the slides. The first theme is uncertainty about changes, which was about the kind of complex process that participants went through when they were recognizing and adjusting to menopause. In the early stages, all but one participant really, really suffered with kind of new or increased aches and pains, worsening of mood and anxiety type difficulties, leading to them feeling rather unwell. The image of walking through mud for years really stuck with me um, as lots of people found it quite quite significant. And this was actually made worse by the fact that lots of people really struggled to know what was happening to them, although not everybody. Several participants said that they didn't know they were autistic at this point, so didn't have language like alexithymia, the sort of difficulty recognizing internal states, to help them know why they were finding life hard, and could be really, really quite self-critical and especially about not being able to live up to high expectations. Looking at their experiences in hindsight, many became aware of autistic type traits emerging suddenly to the surface. So things like sensory sensitivity and long-standing issues with temperature regulation, for example. One participant found this especially distressing and started to sort of doubt the validity of her experiences, questioning, am I exaggerating? Am I putting this on because I want to get an autism diagnosis? A lot of people got really frustrated with their bodies, feeling very out of control. My body does its own thing. I've got to go along with whatever ride it's taking me on that day, kind of thing. But no, I don't feel like I have any control at all. However, getting to post-menopause for many people seemed to be quite a relief, as that was kind of when things started to settle down. It wasn't all bad though. Some people were very glad to be free of periods in post-menopause, and this is in line with findings of a 2018 study by Gavin Stewart and colleagues, which is called "Life is Much More Difficult to Manage During Periods: Autistic Experiences Menstruation," which is a very to the point title. And however, menstrual issues did get worse in perimenopause for some, and initial changes in routine were quite hard to adjust to for some. And one person's first thought when she stopped menstruating was that she could be pregnant. And I think that really speaks to the lack of information and awareness there is about menopause. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to have favourites, but I think growing self-awareness and self-care was my favourite theme. It was about how events like menopause were a catalyst for participants recognising their own well-being needs and starting to do things differently. It's been a bit of a theme to my life that I push on through, is a quote that I think really summarises participants' kind of long-standing tendency to sort of strive and push themselves no matter what. I thought the icon of spinning plates was quite apt. I was really struck that many had really normalised high levels of discomfort, like lifelong pain or sleep issues. Some, but not all, said that autism diagnosis itself helped them recognise their limits better. The quote, you get an aura and you feel like there's a migraine coming on, you can either carry on what you're doing or run away, and beginning to get a sense of autistic situations like that is quite a good example. And also people kind of felt that they had the kind of legal entitlement or the language to tell other people what they needed. Additionally, lots of people talked about social situations and how kind of setting boundaries and feeling like they didn't have to pretend to be someone they're not. So I'm brilliant at masking, actually. Some of the time I'd rather enjoy it, but the question is whether I choose to anymore. A couple of participants didn't feel particularly attached to their autism diagnosis, but described very similar feelings. But for them, they put it down to sort of aging and menopause itself more than the autism. Autistic postmenopausal women are taking over the world, by the way. As hard as menopause was, a lot of people had a lot of pride that they had kind of got through that and everything they'd learned. And this contrasts a lot with findings from a paper in 2003 by McCarthy and Millard, and they interviewed some women with learning disabilities living in residential care. It's a very sad paper for lots of reasons, as people had a lot of very traumatic experiences of menopause and aging. And in the general population, what we know is that better experiences of menopause have been associated with feeling positive about aging and gaining more independence and being viewed by others as wise. But I strongly suspect that these kind of sentiments weren't afforded to women with learning disabilities in the study, who had a lot of power, I think, taken away from them. Indeed, lots of things became a lot harder for my participants. So for example, some people, one participant said, I live with pain, it's tedious, I've been off work, my salary will be halved, which I kind of abbreviated. And the participants who didn't have these difficulties and were, didn't have so many things to contend with, were very aware of that privilege and recognized that a lot of people with disabilities will find this time very hard. So the third and final discursive theme was navigating support options. So this covered the various challenges that were encountered when attempting to access supports. So hormone replacement therapy, which was prescribed by doctors, was considered very helpful by some participants, but for others it caused very intense side effects and additional complications. And one participant talked about finding relief through alternative medicine and some personal training. There presently isn't any research about autistic experiences of medical menopause management, to my knowledge, but there's a bit of evidence. There's a paper by Matson and Hess in 2011, which kind of suggests that autistic people can be more sensitive to medications than not autistic people. There were very mixed experiences of seeking help from doctors. Having an understanding GP seemed to be a bit of a game changer. So one participant said that their GP really took into account their preferred communication style and processing ways. For example, he writes notes down in my notebook because he knows I can't retain information. Although other participants said that they felt quite dismissed or not taken seriously by participants or got very confusing information. And actually something people said was that a lot of them really struggled to access an autism diagnosis and feel believed. So I think it's something that's really important, I think, is that autistic people assigned female at birth have to contend with a sort of double doubt about the validity of their autism, as well as the validity of any kind of gynecological related pain, something or discomfort, if there is any. Something that felt really apparent is that doctors often didn't have that much information because it hadn't been researched yet, and people often found themselves kind of educating their doctors rather than vice versa. There was one participant who found it quite bewildering when people spoke about menopause to her, but others were aware of but frustrated by taboos around menopause, and actually would go out of their way to sort of subvert these or raise the topic with their friends or even acquaintances. People found it quite helpful to connect to others, in particular to other autistic people going through menopause. And the quote, "It's not just in my head, it's not just irrelevant," something I think sometimes I think I'm just making a fuss, but then when I talk to someone else, they're like, "I'm having the same thing." And I think it's and I think speaking to other autistic people of this, going through similar life transitions was important, but also neurotypical friends as well. And a lot of participants talked about how their lived experiences of distress, which they'd had all their lives, were helpful to their neurotypical friends going through menopause who were having these experiences for the first time. There was However, something that came out really strongly was that people didn't want to rely on friends and peer supports, but actually wanted evidence-based advice to read and digest in their own time. And some people just didn't want to talk about it in the first place. Okay. So there were a couple of limitations to my study, things I wish I'd done different. So firstly, there were a few details of participants taken. So I don't know how representative my sample were of the autistic population in fullness. It's important to note that my participants were really articulate, very willing to be interviewed interviewed verbally by a stranger for a whole hour, and not everyone will want to do that or can do that. Also, to avoid detracting from the focus on language and participants' own perspectives, I made the decision not to ask for much demographic information besides like pronouns and age and about menopause status. And lacking this information may limit the generalizability of findings because, for example, like I say, experience of menopause appears to differ depending on ethnicity, but we also know that ethnic minorities are underrepresented in autism research. So if I do future research, I would definitely make a point of collecting this kind of information or finding ways to try and make people feel safe to raise these topics if they're important. I could have been more participatory, i.e. inviting someone with lived experience of menopause specifically to be involved. This was an assessed piece of undergraduate work, so I thought at the time I had to prove it was 100% my own slog, but I realise now that participatory approaches don't necessarily mean that as a candidate I've not contributed. So take-home messages, autism is complicated and menopause is complicated, and it was very different for everybody. There were things that made it harder, like disruption and discomfort caused by immense changes and not knowing why they were happening. Positive things, though, included not having periods and a sort of increased sense of self-awareness as a result of surviving. Interestingly, alexithymia, so not being able to read internal states, has been found to be a relatively stable trait according to some papers, yet participants talked about this kind of self-awareness and becoming aware of things as something that they were able to grow over time when they needed to and in a way that was very beneficial. So that got me thinking, for any GPs who might be listening, being supportive and understanding autistic communication differences make a huge difference, and having an awareness of difficulties that can arise in autism in adulthood seems to be very important. And clinicians should ensure that they validate all perspectives and all kind of experiences that all patients, but especially autistic patients, are coming to them with, and are not conveying that message that it's all in their heads or irrelevant or made up because there isn't the research on it yet. Participants highlighted lots of research topics they thought were important, like implications of menopause for executive functioning, role of hormones on digestion, stuff like that. But and whilst participants kind of briefly mentioned their lived experience of these topics, I'm one psychology undergraduate, and I did was at the time, so I didn't really explore those in fullness. But hopefully, eventually, they will be researched. Thanks for listening. The references I mentioned are at the bottom of my paper, which you can Google. The references I mentioned are at the bottom of my paper, which you can Google, and it's open access, and I've included it there. And my email address when I was a student still works, so you can sort of drop me any questions there as well.
That was a great presentation that kind of really built upon the beginning discussion that started this session. we're now going to move into the Q&A section. So I'll just ask the other panelists from this half of the session to come back on. So that is Daniel, Keren and Marianna. We've got quite a lot of questions that came in during the first half of today. So I'll try to get through them, as many of them as I can. And if your question doesn't get answered, the researchers are comfortable with you sending questions by email and they can follow up with that by email. So my first question today is, and this is for everyone, can you tell me a bit about why you chose to study this topic? So I'll go from start to finish. So I'll go Daniel, then Keren, then Marianna.
Thanks, Sarah. So my overarching research focus is really on sensory differences in autism, and really I went into this postdoc project through an interest in whether timing and these differences in timing might be a potential underlying mechanism associated with those sensory activity differences. And really my entry point into that some years ago. So when I was an undergraduate student, I was volunteering with the National Autistic Society, working with a teenager, with an autistic teenager, and he most profound element of his experience that really caused a lot of issues for him was related to these sensory differences. And so I'm hoping to better understand those across my career. Now, having got into this time perception and timing more broadly, there's also a lot of other interesting elements that seem to be talking to a lot of autistic people. There are components related to time that impact on them in a number of different ways. And I think the current understanding is too reductive. And so we're hoping to shed a bit more light from there.
And Keren.
Yeah, so through my PhD research, which has predominantly been looking at the links between sensory reactivity and mental health, specifically anxiety. And kind of as I started down that road, I really wanted to look more into like the actual sensory experiences of autistic individuals and from their perspective. So as well as kind of doing the more quantitative research that I've done, looking at those kinds of like links, I wanted to be able to kind of work with autistic people to actually include that from their perspective as well, and look at kind of other things that might have been missed between those links, and see if there was actually any other outcomes that might have come up. So yeah, that's how this project happened, and from obviously working with you, Sarah.
And Marianna, what about you? What made you choose to study this topic?
So I knew I definitely wanted to do something autism related, and I was quite fascinated by that and continue to be. And I really like asking people about their lives, and it was a skill I really wanted to develop. And my supervisor, his specialism is kind of sexual health and gendered usage of health services. So I kind of had to think about topics I could do within that. And I guess as I was thinking, I was seeing so many overlaps between the way that we talk about autism and menopause. Like often, if you sort of look at tabloids, often they're not exactly talked about in the most loveliest of ways, and yet they're things that are kind of inevitable, and I guess most people maybe wouldn't want to, are things that that exist, and I'm quite happy with my autism, and I'm sure most of us feel many of us feel similar ways. And also experiences like they're not always sort of taken as seriously as we think about. They're often quite taboo sometimes. So it just struck me how many overlaps there were. And then just sort of going on social media and seeing what people were saying, and a lot of people were kind of asking for more investigation of this experience that they were having. So and there wasn't at that time there wasn't any research published when I was in the planning stages. So it just felt something quite important.
That's all kind of like very interesting to see where the different start. I've got a question for Daniel from the Q&A, and this is, I guess, asking you to do more research in this area. So do you have any plans to see how the pandemic may have affected time estimation and kind of all the other impacts of time that you researched between both groups? And the person thinks it'd be very interesting to see what it is.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think something that's really important in this area. There is sort of in the wider field, as you might expect, given our experiences over the past year and a bit, that there's a bit of work there is going on looking at how the pandemic has impacted on timing more broadly. We don't have any specific plans to look at this. The project actually should have finished, but was delayed by the pandemic. So we unfortunately don't have time to factor this in. Really interesting, and particularly I think using more qualitative approaches to try and better understand that. So that could, yeah, it's a really interesting idea, and hopefully something that I will get a chance to look at some point soon.
And then I have a question for Keren. I'm going to mentally attempt to put together two questions because they're asking for a bit more clarification. So the first half of it is, why did you choose to leave out proprioceptive senses? And then also kind of asking for a bit more clarification about whether no co-occurring conditions diagnosed or self-diagnosed. So I think that's asking if the group that had no co-occurring conditions, whether the no co-occurring conditions were self-diagnosed or whether it was the autism. I'm not entirely sure, but it's an interesting kind of point.
Yeah. So just for that part, everything was, we asked people to report if they had a formal diagnosis. So it might be that it was self-diagnosed, but we did ask specifically for people to report the things that they were formally diagnosed with. But we obviously didn't do any checks and we didn't ask for evidence of that. So, but again, we didn't feel like that was a massive issue. So yeah, that would all have been reported, though they didn't have a diagnosis. So it is also possible that those people might have co-occurring conditions that have not yet been diagnosed. And for proprioception, that's a very good question. It was more because initially we didn't even have interoception, and we were just looking at kind of the standard sensory domains. But then we were like, because it was already quite a large online questionnaire and we didn't want the burden to be too much. So then we were like, oh, I think we should look at interoception based on kind of existing research. But I definitely think that looking at like proprioception and the vestibular sense is really, really important, and something that I definitely would like to also go and examine that a bit more. And I actually feel like that because of all the kind of repetitive behavior research, there's actually a lot of links there that I think would be really, really interesting to find out more from the perspective of autistic people. So that definitely might be something to look into.
That's a very interesting answer. And then a question for Marianna. Did you find that hypersensitivity to physical changes was an issue and that they weren't believed by their doctors?
Yes, I think the answer to that is yes. I think there are some participants who mentioned the fact that they were really, really suffering and would kind of go to their GP, kind of reporting that as best they could, and having tests being run and and actually not finding, and the doctor's not finding a result, and kind of thinking, okay, well, there's nothing there, so that therefore it's not real and stuff, which was kind of very, very off-putting and quite traumatic, I'd imagine. And I think a lot of people talked about having a lot of really strong side effects to medications as well, and actually not having the extent of that sensitivity being believed by their doctors, or or kind of, really, are you sure you're feeling that bad because of this thing? Most people find it really helpful, and yeah, and sort of just people kind of. And also people getting that kind of response that, oh, you are menopausal, this is totally normal, you're meant to be suffering, you're meant to be uncomfortable, it's meant to be horrible, which again I think is quite sort of reductive as well, because I think I think everyone has the right to be able to manage their health and be in as little discomfort as possible.
Thank you for that. I think the kind of it's meant to hurt is something that's potentially used a lot in medicine, and it doesn't need to be used. Another question for Daniel. I think this one's a bit of a technical one on your data collection. So which modes of communication did participants answer the time estimation tasks? So was this just verbal? I think they're kind of asking about how that may have included those who may not respond verbally to these sorts of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, there was one specific task where, which I refer to as like the clock task in my talk, where the participants were asked to make an estimate around time. And so participants typed in their responses there. It's quite an unusual task. It's quite widely used in the sort of wider time perception literature, which is why we went with this. And it's asking people to do something a bit unusual, making this estimation in milliseconds, not something we actually do that often in our everyday lives, but people actually tend to be remarkably good at it. And this was entirely, so use this exact same method. As it happens, all the participants in our study communicated verbally, and also we hadn't made any sort of adjustments for participants who respond non-verbally. We actually didn't specify that participants had to communicate verbally to take part in the study, but it just, as it happened, these people who took part. And really, yeah, the important thing being on that task that there were no differences. Autistic participants were similarly as good as the neurotypicals at making estimations and using that particular methodology.
Cool. Very interesting answer. For Keren, there's a couple of questions to pick from, and I'm just conscious of the time. Although this one could be for everyone, I guess. So what steps did your research take to try and involve non-white people? And do you have any thoughts on how future autism research could be made less white? I will caveat this with there is a very interesting roundtable this afternoon in which this topic will be discussed in much more detail. But if there's any kind of answers that any of the panel have that they wish to add at the moment.
I mean, yeah, I can give a short answer because I'm sure that panel this afternoon will be so much more informative. But I think for this study, it wasn't anything that we didn't seek certain communities. It was just recruiting online in various sources. So it was just people who wished to take part would approach and take part. And I do kind of feel like with online research, a lot of the time it does seem to throw back a kind of predominantly white sample. But I know in our other studies, like in children, that I've been working on as part of my PhD, we have worked a lot closer with the local community through our recruitment because we've been doing testing in person. And when we were recruiting for kind of much younger children, like aged 3 to 5 years, like we went and actually did recruitment drives like at events and things. And actually our sample for that project is much more diverse. So I think like kind of going to communities and building those kinds of connections in the community is one of the ways that I've noticed that we do have a much more diverse sample. But that's just the reflections from my own personal experience.
Are there any other reflections that any of the other panelists want to add to this?
I think so. So I think a kind of a step forward for me would have been to ask, and I kind of touched on it in my presentation that actually I omitted to do that, and I wish I had. And I think I mean I work in NHS mental health services, and the sort of advice I'm hearing is that it's actually really helpful for us as sort of clinicians to proactively mention, what I'm white, and as as a clinician, and I understand that you're of an ethnic minority. How does that feel, or can you is there anything about your experience that's important you'd like to tell me about, or I'd like you to let you know that I'm open to hearing those things or whatever. So I guess sort of making, I'm guessing that kind of qualitative research, I'm imagining that it will be quite similar to that, where actually sort of naming it, and that way you can kind of, those people might feel a bit more safe to talk about those experiences perhaps. I'm sure that kind of thing will be talked about more this afternoon, and also just sort of keeping tabs on who, and just asking the question, actually including that in the write-up, I think is really important.
Yeah, definitely. We've got time for one more question, and then we're going to take. Oh wait, Daniel, you had a little unmute on.
Oh, I'll be super quick. I was just going to add one more thought on there. It's just that similarly to Marianna, I didn't collect any demographic information, and it's something that I realised at the end of this study and should have been doing in previous work. And we're based in Manchester in an extremely ethnically diverse area, and we're putting out recruitment posters everywhere. And much like Keren said, it still just happens that we just end up with a predominantly white sample. So it's clearly something that we're going to need to think about more about how we're reaching out to people from different minority ethnic groups, and how we can be more active in encouraging participation in research and having them represented.
I think that's all kind of very fair reflections from the panel, and something that will likely be reflected in the session later on today. Final question. Oh, I feel like I've got too much power. I'm going to ask it to Marianna. What kind of challenges were described when participants stated support from friends and family weren't preferred?
So, for example, I mean, a couple of people said that it just was a topic that felt very personal, and they didn't always know how to react when other people raised it with them, and they were sort of cautious about the reactions they might get from other people, like perhaps like people saying, why are you talking to me about that kind of thing? So I guess, and some people kind of thought that it was kind of, maybe people raising that topic was kind of trying to build a friendship that they maybe weren't sure if was there or something. I think as well, sometimes when people were talking to sort of other family members that, about it, often other people would say, well, I never went through that, or I just put on a brave face, and things which could maybe be a little bit difficult to hear when someone's really struggling and feeling like it's almost a moral judgment that they're not able to manage so so bravely, quote unquote. And also people were just saying that they didn't want to rely on that as, sometimes they just didn't want to talk to people. They just wanted to read some information and have that sort of printed in black and white, which was relevant to them.
Thank you. Just to kind of wrap up this Q&A session, as we still have quite a flood of questions in our Q&A, please do reach out to the researchers outside of this session if you still have a burning desire for an answer. Hopefully not literally burning, just like a strong desire, not a fire desire. And we will be going into a 10-minute break, which means that we'll be back at 11:52, and we'll be hearing from Gavin Stewart, Helen Taylor, and Sara King, which will then be followed by another Q&A panel. Thank you to our first half for such interesting conversation and research. Go grab another drink, another break. Good morning and welcome back to our physical health session. We'll be starting off the second half of this session with Gavin Stewart. He'll be talking about the experiences of social isolation and loneliness in middle-aged and older autistic adults. Gavin conducts research that predominantly focuses on older autistic adults rather than children and young people. Just waiting for Gavin to turn on his camera and get his slides. We're getting there, it's all good.
Hi, sorry, can you hear and see me?
Hear and see you perfectly.
That's great. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name's Gavin Stewart, and today I'll be talking to you about one of my projects which explores the experience of social isolation and loneliness in middle-aged and older autistic adults. As a warning before I begin, I will be talking about being socially isolated in this presentation, so this topic may be upsetting to some. Social isolation is an objective experience where someone has little to no social contact to others. Loneliness, however, is a subjective experience where someone is dissatisfied with the quantity or the quality of their social interactions or relationships. While social isolation and loneliness often co-occur, they are two separate experiences. Social isolation and loneliness are often associated with a profound negative impact to mental health and quality of life. While someone can become socially isolated or feel lonely at any age, these experiences often become more common as you get older. And this is particularly an issue in later life, with research by Age UK noting that about 1/5 of older adults often go a week without speaking to anyone. When considering autistic people and their experience of social isolation and loneliness, it's been well documented in autistic populations that social isolation and loneliness are commonly experienced throughout childhood and adulthood. However, few studies have examined these experiences in middle and older age. This lack of middle and older age research is quite surprising when you consider the prevalence rate of autism. Autism has a prevalence of around 1%, and this rate is comparable across the lifespan. As the UK has an aging population, the majority of these individuals will be adults or older adults. So despite this large number of autistic adults in the population, research is mostly focused on childhood experiences and outcomes. And this is reflected in the number of publications that examine older age in autistic populations. So as a step towards addressing this lack of research, the study that I'll be presenting to you today will be specifically focusing on autism in middle to older age. In this study, we examined whether there are differences in the experience of social isolation and loneliness between a group of autistic and non-autistic adults aged 40 years and older. We also examined gender differences and the influence of age and symptoms of poor mental health on these experiences. To do this, we used cross-sectional data from the Age Well Autism study. The Age Well Autism study was an online survey that we advertised through social media, the Autistica network, and through our participant databases at King's and Goldsmiths. The topics we explored in the study were influenced by conversations and steering from middle-aged and older autistic adults. And today I'll be presenting the results from questionnaires about the participants' experiences of social isolation and loneliness. Also, it's important to note that this data was collected in summer 2019, so this is well before the COVID-19 pandemic started. In total, 428 participants aged 40 to 93 years old took part in our survey. The autistic group includes 265 participants who either have an autism diagnosis or who self-identify as autistic. We also have 167 non-autistic participants who form a comparison group. Both groups were matched on mean age, which was around 60 years old, and they were also matched on gender, with approximately half of the sample being female. We did find that the autistic group were less likely to live alone and less likely to be employed than the non-autistic group. To measure the experience of social isolation, we use the Lubin Social Connectedness Scale. This is a 6-item questionnaire that asks about the frequency of contact with family and friends. A higher score in this questionnaire represents being well socially connected, while lower scores indicate social isolation. So moving on to our results, the first question asked participants about how many family members or friends they see or hear from at least once a month. We found that the autistic group were in contact with significantly fewer family members and friends each month. When thinking about the number of people who might be socially isolated, approximately 20% of the autistic group had no contact from family or friends, compared to about 5% in the non-autistic group. When considering gender differences, autistic women were in contact with significantly fewer family members and friends each month than autistic men, but the effect sizes of these differences were small. The second question asked participants about how many family members or friends they feel close to and could call for help. We found the autistic group had significantly fewer family members and friends that they could rely on for help. Again, approximately 20% of the autistic group had no family or friends they could rely on for help, compared to about 3% in the non-autistic group. No gender differences were found in these analyses. The final question asks about how many family members or friends the participant feels at ease with when talking about private matters. We once again found that the autistic group had significantly fewer family members and friends that they could talk to about private matters. About 15% of the autistic group had no family members or friends they could talk to about private matters, compared to about 3% in the non-autistic group. When considering gender differences, autistic women were found to have significantly fewer family members and friends that they could talk to about private matters than autistic men. However, the effect sizes of these differences are small. We then examined the relationship between social isolation and age. To keep the next few slides as simple as possible, I'm only showing the responses from the male participants in this slide, and I'll show the female participant data in the next. So for men's experience of social isolation, which is poor social connectedness, we found that the number of social connections decreased with age. This was the case for men in both groups. However, as autistic men have lower social connectedness than non-autistic men, this could increase the likelihood of social isolation later in life. Next, we looked at women's experience of social isolation. Like men, we found that as women get older, they also have fewer social connections in their lives. And this was the case for women in both groups. Once again, as autistic women have lower social connectedness than non-autistic women, this could increase the likelihood of social isolation later in life. So in this slide, I've removed all of the data points, but here are the male and female correlation lines for social isolation and age associations. The dashed line represents the male correlation lines, and the solid lines represent the female correlation lines. So we then looked at whether the strength of associations differed between the whole autistic group and the whole non-autistic group. We found the strength of associations were comparable, so each group had a similar decrease in social connectedness with age. However, when looking at gender differences within each group, we found that autistic men's social connectedness had a stronger negative association with age than autistic women. This gender difference was also found in the non-autistic group. So, given the lower rates of social connectedness found in the autistic group, this could mean that autistic men might be more susceptible to being socially isolated later in life. So, next we examined the experience of loneliness in our sample. To do this, we use the UCLA Loneliness Scale version 3, and this is a 20-item questionnaire that asks about the frequency of feeling socially isolated and lonely. A higher score in this questionnaire represents feeling lonelier. We found that autistic men and women had significantly higher rates of loneliness than non-autistic comparisons. When considering gender differences, women reported being significantly lonelier than men in both groups. This gender difference was found when only comparing autistic women to autistic men as well. However, the effect sizes of these differences are small. Additionally, no interactions of group and gender were found in these analyses. This pattern of results remained when controlling for current symptoms of depression and anxiety, as well as age. So next we examine the relationship between loneliness and age. As with the social isolation slides, I'm only showing the male data here to keep things as simple as possible, and the female data will be on the next slide. So for men's experience of social isolation, we found that as men get older, they're more likely to feel lonely. Next, we looked at the women's experience of loneliness. A slightly different pattern of results was found in these female participants. For the autistic women, like autistic men, we found that as they get older, they're more likely to feel lonely. However, this association wasn't found for non-autistic women who had more stable loneliness with age. But this could be influenced by the smaller number of non-autistic women age 80+ who participated in this study. Additionally, the strength of these associations differed between groups, with the autistic women's feelings of loneliness increasing more with age than non-autistic women. So again, here are the loneliness and age correlation lines for the men and women in both groups. The dashed lines are for males and the solid lines are for females. We once again looked at whether the strength of associations differed between groups. We found that the strength of association between loneliness and age were stronger in the autistic group than in the non-autistic group. Also, when considering gender differences within each group, we found that men in both groups were more likely to feel lonelier with age compared to women. This finding is interesting, as autistic women on average report more feelings of loneliness than autistic men, yet autistic men appear to catch up on these feelings of loneliness as they get older. So that brings me to the end of the results of this study. Before I move on to the final conclusions, I just want to highlight a few limitations. First, this is an online study, so that may be a barrier to participation. Also, the participants of this study were mostly well educated, so they may not be representative of the broader autistic community. Furthermore, older adults who engage in voluntary medical research tend to be healthier than the general population, so this may lead to a lack of generalizability. And finally, as previously mentioned, the data being discussed today is cross-sectional, so it's not possible to infer age-related change from these findings. So as a final conclusion for this study, using well-standardized measures of social connectedness and feelings of loneliness, we found that middle-aged and older autistic adults reported being less socially connected and feeling lonelier than the non-autistic comparison group. Approximately 20% of the autistic group were socially isolated, compared to less than 5% of the non-autistic group. When thinking about the association of these experiences with age, the experience of social isolation and loneliness may increase with age. And this could result in autistic adults being particularly susceptible to being socially isolated and lonely later in life. And finally, these findings highlight the need for evidence-based interventions and support programs to address social isolation and to reduce feelings of loneliness for autistic people as they age. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I'd like to thank my supervisors, Francesca Happy and Rebecca Charlton, for their support. I'd also like to thank the participants who took part in this research and Autistica for advertising the study to their network members. I'd also like to thank our funders, and importantly, I'd like to thank you for listening. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them during the Q&A section at the end of this panel. My email and my Twitter handle are also at the top right of this slide if you'd like to contact me directly. Thank you.
Thank you for that fascinating talk, Gavin. It kind of really highlighted potentially quite stark realities for autistic adults as they get older, and that there is a lot of difference in that social connectedness and the loneliness for autistic people. Our next speaker is Helen Taylor, and she'll be talking about the autism health checks and how they were co-designed for kind of the checks that are being done for GP settings, which are also known as primary healthcare.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm Helen Taylor. I'm a clinical research associate at Newcastle University, and I'm going to be talking today about co-designing a primary care health check for autistic adults. And this study is led by Professor Jeremy Parr and Dr. Barry Ingham, and it's funded by Autistica. So I just realised it's not on a PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so in terms of the background, from the autism literature so far, we know that autistic people are more likely to experience a range of physical health conditions, premature mortality, and also experience multiple barriers in effectively accessing healthcare. We also know that primary care health checks improve access to effective healthcare for certain populations, such as those with learning disabilities. And the creation of a health check for autistic people is identified as a research priority at a recent workshop that involved autistic people, supporters, health professionals, and researchers. And it's also flagged up as important within the NHS long-term plan. So in terms of the objectives for this study, we wanted to understand autistic people, supporters, and health professionals' views about the acceptability, importance, and design of a primary care health check for autistic adults. and we wanted to be able to co-design that with autistic adults, health professionals and supporters. So in terms of our methods, we conducted a survey of 444 autistic adults and 17 consultees. So these were people who supported or answered on behalf of those who were unable to consent or report for themselves. We recruited these through a national autism research database. We also carried out some consultation groups and interviews. So these were 51 participants, 30 of which were autistic adults, 9 adults with learning disabilities, 7 carers and supporters, and 5 primary care health professionals. These were recruited through social media and local networks in the northeast of England. And we did 8 consultation groups and 7 interviews. And we used an iterative process, so building on the previous information and using it to inform discussions at the next groups. So in terms of the topics, we looked at the previous experiences of health checks in healthcare, what adjustments might be needed to healthcare, the design of the health check itself, the use and content of the pre-appointment questionnaire, and the implementation of the health check in the NHS. And we built on international resources and expertise. So for example, the Autism Healthcare Accommodations Tool, the AHAT, and other Aspire tools, which are used in America to help autistic people to access primary care services. So in terms of the survey results, most people told us that they wanted a regular health check for autistic adults. They wanted it to be available for all autistic adults, so not just those with or without a learning disability, and they wanted it to be offered annually. Most people rated staff training about autism and delivering health checks as very important. And most people also thought it was important to provide information about health needs before the health check appointment. And they wanted online and paper options to provide this information. And almost all respondents thought adjustments were needed to standard healthcare, which is in keeping with other literature that's gone before. In terms of what factors made it easier to access healthcare or more challenging, we categorised the responses that we had, and what I've done here is put together those that were the highest frequency to show you today. So in terms of things that made it easier, health professionals was having a familiar clinician or somebody who was knowledgeable in autism. The environmental factors were having a low-level sensory stimulation environment. So for example, low-level lighting or a quiet waiting area. Providing information on the health check itself, so what it will involve and who you'll see. Having accessible appointments, so easy to find locations, and also having flexible appointment times. The flexibility in the appointments, so having these tailored to individual need, and also keeping to the appointment time, so minimising waiting. And in terms of the factors that made it challenging, these are very similar. So in terms of the health professionals, it was having health professionals that were patronising or didn't have knowledge of autism, having environmental factors such as a high-level sensory stimulation environment, having appointments that were inaccessible, so not easy to find, and also not at flexible times of the day, not having any flexibility in the appointments themselves, not keeping to time, and not providing information about the health check itself. So moving on to think about the consultation and interview results, what we did here was we did some thematic analysis on the transcripts and identified 4 key themes and also a number of sub-themes. I can't talk about all of those today, but what I can do is show you a few sub-themes within each of the themes. So the first theme is that the health check should cover relevant and health and social concerns. So the first sub-theme here is that it needs to cover key areas of need experienced by autistic people. And this might be things like mental health, sleep difficulties, diet and nutrition, social support and social activities. And the GP here said, we found lots of unmet needs, lots of long-term conditions to do with obesity, particularly for diabetes, sleep apnea, that sort of thing. Another sub-theme looked at the breadth of the health check, and people talked about the need for it to be biopsychosocial. And by that I mean to cover physical health, but also psychological and social functioning. And people talked about opportunities to signpost people to services for support in these areas as well. And a practice nurse sums this up by saying, social, sensory, what's going on in your life, that's not just related to blood pressure and pulses and blood tests and things, more emotional stuff, mental health stuff. So the second theme talks about health check processes and how these need to meet the needs and preferences of autistic people. So the first sub-theme talked about balancing the amount of information covered. So people talked very passionately about the importance of including all areas that might be important to autistic people, but also to find a balance to not involve too much information and gathering too much that it might actually cause people to disengage from the health check process and feel overwhelmed. So an autistic person illustrates that here by saying, "It felt that she was doing quite a lot. I would have preferred it to have been done over 2 appointments." Another sub-theme was talking about the importance of preparation for the appointment. So this was being able to get some information about what the health check would involve beforehand, but also being able to share information about themselves before the appointment so that the person was more familiar with their needs and in terms of health and reasonable adjustments. And so this is shown here with this quote from an autistic person that says, "Without that," and they're talking about sharing information about sensory and communication needs, "they can't even deal with your health. So those 2 are vital." In terms of theme 3, this one talked about integration of the health check within primary care services. So in terms of this one, the first sub-theme was talking about managing expectations. So health professionals talked a lot about managing expectations from autistic people and supporters in terms of the reasonable adjustments that they can provide, but also in terms of the services that they might then refer on to for further support, like mental health and social care. And just an acknowledgement that these are very lacking at the moment. So an example here from a GP is it says, you can go shopping and they can turn the lights down, turn the music off. You can go to trampoline parks at a time where no one's allowed, and it's very quiet, but we can't do that. We can't say no other patients are allowed for an hour. It's very difficult. Another sub-theme was talking about how to embed it in current practice. So people talked about possibly having an autism champion within the practice, so somebody who could lead on raising awareness and implementing the reasonable adjustments. They talked about perhaps hosting these as clinics, which might make it a bit easier to offer reasonable adjustments, and also talking about a select group of GPs doing them within each practice. And that's illustrated here in the quote that says, "Have a niche group of people that just do the checks for those particular individuals so that we're the best at doing it as opposed to spreading it out to everybody." And the fourth theme is talking about effective adult to professional engagement. So how does the clinician engage with the autistic adult during the process of the health check? And for the first sub-theme for this was talking about using a person-centered approach. So very much focusing on trying to build rapport and engagement. And practice nurse sums it up by saying, "I start off saying, what's your concerns today? What do you need help with? What's going on with you that you want me to help you with?" They also talked in another sub-theme about gathering information in a supportive and sensitive way. And this was really, again, about trying to minimize anxiety, particularly for those who may experience health anxiety as well. And also to try not to overwhelm people and cause them to disengage from the health check process. So an autistic person sums it up here by saying, if they tell us why they're asking the questions, then we'll be more relaxed and we'll be able to give them the information that they need. So just thinking about the conclusions for the study, we can see that from the survey that the health check is likely to be well received by autistic people. We've gathered key information about the design and delivery of an NHS primary care health check, and to ensure it's acceptable to autistic people who receive the health check, but also to health professionals who will be delivering the health check. And I think some of the key points that we took from this were that it needs to focus on mental health and social needs alongside physical health, that we need to provide an opportunity to share information about health and adjustment needs before the appointment, that we need to manage expectations around service provision and reasonable adjustments, the importance of engaging supporters and understanding the differences in experiences of autistic people and the heterogeneity of needs and preferences. And we've co-designed the health check with autistic people, carers and supporters and health professionals. I'm not going to have the chance to present that here, but we're actually in the process of these papers being put through to submission in a publication, and it'll have more information in those in due course. So in terms of the study, we're moving on to the next stage of the study, which is to test out the health check that we've designed, well, we've co-designed. And this will be done through a randomised control trial to evaluate clinical and cost effectiveness of the health check in UK general practices, and that'll be in the northeast of England. Just lastly, some thank you and acknowledgements. So a large study team is involved in this project. Like I said before, it's led by Professor Jeremy Parr and Dr. Barry Ingham, but there's a range of people involved, including researchers with many areas of expertise, health professionals, autistic people, and carers of autistic people. If you want any further information about the study, we have a website, which is on the screen below, and I think they're going to pop into the chat as well. And also my email address for health checks is on there. So if you want to ask any further questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Helen. That was a deeply interesting presentation, particularly about how health checks are kind of adapted from what people may understand as the learning disability health checks and made so much more applicable to autistic people, and potentially reducing those health inequalities that do occur for autistic people. And there's still time for people to pop their questions in the Q&A function for Helen when we come to our Q&A panel after our next speaker, who is Sara King. She'll be talking about maternity services, and her presentation is entitled "How do maternity services support autistic women and birthing people now? What improvements could be made to help autistic people and the staff who support them?"
Hello, good morning everybody. Thanks very much, Sarah. I'm Sara King. I'm a PhD student working within the Autism Centre for Education and Research at the University of Birmingham. I'm here to talk to you today about my research project about maternity services for autistic women and birthing people as service users and the staff that support them, as Sarah said. So I will be talking about maternity services. So if you feel this may be uncomfortable, please feel free to mute or leave if that's not something that you want to listen to, although I'm not going to be getting into lots of detail. So I'm at the very early stages of my project, so I'll be discussing my planning and some extremely early findings from the project. So why have I chosen this project? It's driven by my own personal interest. I'm autistic with other autistic family members. I had a late diagnosis of autism after I'd already had my children, and this topic had a personal impact on me and on other autistic people I've spoken with. I'm fairly new to research. I carried out a small project as part of a postgraduate diploma, and this used questionnaires to explore the experiences of autistic people when using maternity services. I was so grateful to have generous and detailed responses from the individuals involved, and this led to more questions and to me developing this current PhD project. So autism in females has not been known or understood until fairly recently, and more males than females have been historically diagnosed. There's increasing awareness and diagnosis of females, and as this happens, services will need to be able to support appropriately, and maternity services is an area in the past that may have been missed. So it's important that the autistic voice is heard in autism research. And I've had some funding support from the Charles Sharlin scheme via Autistica, and I'm self-funding part of the project. My intention is to compensate the autistic participants for their time and costs incurred in line with Austica's policy, so I'm very grateful for that support. So what do I want to find out? I'm keen to explore the phenomenon from different perspectives to gain a full picture. So I'll be looking at statistical information and policy, also about understanding the experiences of midwives, doctors, nurses, receptionists and other staff that work in a person-facing role supporting autistic people. And then to understand the experience directly from autistic women and birthing people as service users. So the literature review found limited information relating to autistic people's experiences of maternity services, motherhood or childbirth. And this is increasing, but it's still under-researched. And the majority of the literature using my search terms is medical related, looking at having an autistic child or exploring the experience of parenting an autistic child. There was very little about the autistic parent. So to give further context, I widened the search to consider maternity services and mental health, and also maternity services and combined with anxiety and depression and disability, just to give me some further context. Some of the papers that were looking at the emotional well-being of mothers are looking at the autistic traits of a child and not taking into account that the mother's challenges could potentially be due to own potential autism or autistic traits. So what are the issues around this? Maternity services are accessed at an important time for anyone with the experiences impacting on the parent and the child in terms of their physical, mental health and confidence in parenting skills. And these experiences, whether good or bad, will shape the parenting relationship, affecting confidence and general well-being, and could impact on other family members and the wider community. And we heard earlier about the challenges around menopause and also sensory challenges from the other presenters this morning. So autistic women could be affected in those areas and may need more care and support at this time than the general population of women. And lack of good care can lead to feelings of isolation, anxiety and depression. What will be good practice for an autistic service user would actually benefit all service users. So as part of my PhD, I've been able to undertake various research modules to support my development. This has been invaluable, and it led to me discovering the heuristic inquiry approach to research. I immediately felt an affinity with this, and it seemed to fit my own learning style. It felt like how I feel with special interest. Heuristic specifically requires that the researcher has personal experience of the particular phenomenon and uses their insights into the process. And it's for they're powerful and encompassing ways of looking at big events, and having a child clearly fits this. It's a big life experience. It needs voices other than the researcher's own in order to explore as many facets of the experience as possible. This is key to exploring my subject because I'll be sharing my own experiences, but also want to hear and share others' stories too. And this type of inquiry felt really appropriate as the question seems to choose the researcher, and it's deeply personal and flexible, and you can follow your nose in your the way you research, develop your research, which I really like. So this slide shows the different elements of my research project. So I carried out freedom of information requests to explore the context in terms of statistical information, and I'll discuss this more in the next slide. Phase 1A is questionnaires with maternity services staff, and I developed a questionnaire to collect a mix of quantitative and qualitative data. I had this sense checked by an autistic doula and an autistic mum. So I'm seeking responses from maternity services staff who are currently working in England in a person-facing role to explore their experience and knowledge of autism and to understand what training they've had and how well supported they feel to support an autistic person. I've recruited via contacts. I had contacts with National Maternity Voices and Maternity Voices Partnerships, and also the Royal College of Midwives, and my own social media and own contacts and Autistica contacts too. So this is live and I'm still seeking participants. So please do feel free to circulate this and I'll share a link. So phase 1B will happen next. Sorry about the rustling noise, I've got notes. This will happen next. I'll be carrying out a small number of qualitative interviews with some of the respondents from the questionnaire to gain some rich data and follow up anything that comes out of the questionnaire responses. And phase 2 will be, I want to understand from autistic women and birthing people about their experiences, and I'll be carrying out interviews next year. So just a bit more about the freedom of information stage. This was carried out over a year ago, and since then I'm aware that some changes are underway with the organisations I approached and the way they collect data, so I will be revisiting this. I submitted an exploratory list of questions, and NHS Digital, NHS England and Health Education England at that point did not hold any data about the numbers of autistic women accessing maternity services, anything about autism training that was carried out. And for me, this raises questions about how planning and funding in this area is determined, for example, for training and staffing. Some data may be held at trust level. However, in the previous study that I mentioned, I approached 4 trusts for this data and only 2 held data about numbers of autistic service users. So I'm just going to share a few early findings from the survey. So the data collection process is ongoing, as I've said, and I've just picked out a very small number of key points. This is not yet fully analysed. There's a mix of qualitative and quantitative data because I wanted to include opportunities for free text comments. And the questionnaire asks a range of questions about experience and knowledge of autism, about training, and about work processes relating to supporting an autistic person. So I had 29 responses, and of those 29, 24 of the respondents were midwives, and the remainder were a mix of other roles. 24 of the responses from the 29 said they had not had any autism training since starting their role. 5 had had training, and of those 5, 2 had had specific autism training, 2 had it as part of a disability or wider training, and 1 commented that it was other. So, and of 27 who answered the question, how important is autism training, 22 said it was important or extremely important. Of the 19 who answered the question, what priority would you give autism training as a training need, as opposed to other training relating to your role, 6 said it was a high priority and 13 said it was a media priority. And bearing in mind, this was in the time of the pandemic. So obviously there's a significant amount of training happening at this point. So some more findings. 22 out of 27 respondents that answered this question said they'd gained understanding of autism outside of their current role. And that was a mix of personal experience. For example, they may have been autistic themselves, they had an autistic family member or a colleague or friend, or from other sources. And 18 of those 22 who had understanding gained from outside of their current role said that this would affect how they supported an autistic person. And they shared some excellent examples of individualized care and how in some cases they had supported an autistic person, or what they would do if they needed to support an autistic person. So for me, this raise questions about other staff who haven't had any autism training and don't have any personal experiences or understanding themselves. And if you bear in mind that only from this cohort of 29, only 5 had had training, I just wonder how those other people are supported in their role when they need to support an autistic person. So when asked about relevant legislation that respondents were aware of, this was free text, and only 3 of the 29 mentioned the Autism Act. And remembering this group had a particularly high proportion of those with a personal experience of autism. So all of the respondents were asked, do you know of any organisational policies within your workplace that relate to access for services for autistic people? And of the 29 respondents, only 3 identified a policy, and these were either relating to learning disability or special circumstances screening. So I'm very grateful to the respondents so far who've been really generous with sharing very detailed and insightful qualitative information about their personal experiences and their practice. And I'm taking time now to reflect on that. And when the survey's closed, I'll carry out a full analysis of that. I've been contacted by several people who have an interest in this area, who wish to be kept informed and have a strong interest in participating in the maternity staff interviews. So I was really pleased about that too. So the next steps, by next year, I'll aim to have completed all the data collection for the project, and will have analysed all of the maternity services staff data. I hope to have some headline findings from the autistic participants in a year's time. And then what I'll be doing is looking at how all that fits together from the different perspectives. So I hope that at that point I'll really be able to bring this project to life with some very specific information and findings. So thank you very much for listening. I'd just also like to thank the participants so far who have responded, and people who have helped me sense checking the questionnaire and help with circulating the information, and to my supervisors and mentor for their ongoing support with that too. And there's just some further information with links. Thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you. I believe Kat has put in the chat section the Twitter and the link to the survey for anyone who wants to take part or to share it with others that they know might want to take part. We'll now move on to the Q&A section for this half of the session. So that's with Helen, Sara and Gavin. And we'll start off with the kind of introductory question that's asked to everyone. And I'll ask this to Gavin, then Helen, then Sara in the order that you presented. Can you tell me a little bit about why you chose to study this topic? So Gavin.
Sure. So my broader research focus is autism and aging. So that's why I chose to explore these experiences in middle and older age adults. The particular topic of social isolation and loneliness resonated with me on a few different levels. I think the finding from Age UK was quite startling about how many older people go with so little social contact each week. Additionally, on a more sort of personal level, I have a lot of older adults in my life, and I have first-hand experience sort of observing their social experiences and how they've changed as they've gotten older, and how easy it can be for an older person to become isolated and lonely. So I was able to merge these sort of personal motivations with my academic interests in autism and older age, and we're able to explore that in this current study.
Perfect. And Helen, what about you? What brought you to this topic area?
Well, my background's as a clinical psychologist working into child and adolescent mental health services. So I worked in the NHS for many, many years, and I guess saw a lot of gaps in services and service provision, particularly for autistic people. And I suppose felt a bit frustrated, really, I suppose, with the limited opportunities to kind of influence that whilst working within the NHS. So I guess more recently, I've moved across to research to try and kind of come at it from a different angle, if you like, and try and, I guess, develop things that could be useful and gather the evidence around that. So I'm fortunate to work in a department which is really sort of passionate about improving the lives and experiences of autistic people. And this study came along and looked of interest really to me because of the healthcare aspect. So I guess the opportunity to try and influence people's experiences of healthcare was really important to me. And I think really what we found in our study and kind of by talking to people is that what we're suggesting and what is coming out is not really, it's not high end, it's not expensive. So the opportunity to perhaps put some small things in that can make a big difference just seemed like too good an opportunity not to be involved in, really. So yeah, that's why I'm doing this one.
Perfect. And just because I can't actually remember if I did it or not, I'm going to say thank you to Sara for the presentation you gave. It was very kind of clear, grounded, and looks to be highly impactful as you progress through your research. And then getting back to the question, what brought you to study this topic? I know you covered it a little bit in your presentation, but kind of a bit broader, I guess.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, I've mentioned some of this in my presentation, but it really led from my own personal experiences of having my children. I had good care, but I was still affected for some considerable time from the experience. And in terms of sensory, the noise, bustle, other people, being on a ward, not knowing what was happening, that led to me having anxiety and mental health issues after both of my children were born. I didn't know I was autistic at that time, but I did know that I would find the hospital experience difficult. I knew I'd find the environment difficult and I needed lots of information. So I knew that about myself already. When I started a postgraduate diploma, which came about from my own diagnostic process. I'd read about autism and learnt lots about it when I was diagnosed and carried on doing so, and then decided I'm not a researcher, I'm a procurement advisor. That's what I do, and I still work in that field. But I decided to take a postgraduate diploma because I was so interested in the area, and I had to do a special studies project as part of that, and I selected this just from my own experience. I thought it would be interesting. So when I did that, I wondered how the experience was for other autistic people. So my initial project highlighted some real challenges that had been experienced. Some of these link to Marianna's comments earlier from the previous panel, with people describing their sensory experiences not being believed or heard. For example, when they had a strong sense of interoception and awareness of what was happening in their own body. And there's also some crossover with Helen's talk about things like waiting for appointments, engagement and communication, and dealing with some of those challenges. So I wanted to be able to build on that, which is what led to me developing the PhD and looking at it from these different elements. And the main reason for me doing this is to use the research findings to make real practical change and help for autistic people, but also for the staff that are working in that environment that may need more information and knowledge.
Perfect. I'm going to bring our next question over to Gavin, and I'm going to make another hodgepodge attempt to bring together two questions. So it's kind of looking at other demographic factors that may have had an impact, so things like other co-occurring conditions, ethnicity and LGBT status. Were these things that you looked at in your research, or were you unable to collect data on things like ethnicity, LGBT+, or co-occurring conditions? It's a very long question. I hope it makes sense.
Okay, there's really good points. So unfortunately, in that current study, it's not something that we have looked at in terms of ethnicity or sexuality. We have run a set of follow-up interviews to the study where we do collect a lot more demographic information from our participants. And we do ask about experiences of social isolation, loneliness, the types of support that they have in their lives. Unfortunately, we haven't fully analysed that data though, but hopefully we'll be able to sort of look into these sort of demographic factors within that study, and hopefully I'll be able to sort of present that in the future. In terms of sort of physical health and sort of other co-occurring conditions, we didn't look at it in these specific analyses. Physical barriers to socialization are quite common as people get older, so it definitely would be interesting to look at that and how that, what the relationship is with sort of poor physical health with these experiences. In the current study, the participants do self-report whether they have a range of different physical and mental health conditions. So it is definitely something that we could look into, and hopefully it's something that we'll be able to report in the sort of the full paper version of this study.
Perfect. And then I've got a question for Helen. It's basically, people really like what they see and they just want it now. So kind of, when do you think, how long will the next stage of the health check take, so the project take, and when do you expect rollout to happen nationally if it is kind of seen to be feasible, effective, and all of the other things that the NHS wants things to be?
Yep. Okay. Yeah, well, we've just got ethical approval, so we're hoping to start the study sort of early autumn, and I think it'll run for about 3 years by the time we've done all the recruitment, the follow-up, because there's about a 9-month follow-up for the primary outcome measures to look at the change that may have happened, and also obviously the write-up and dissemination. So it's not quick, research never is, but the good thing is we have been funded by Autistica, but also by NHS England for this part of the study. So having them on board, we're actually already having regular workshops with them to try and kind of ensure that they understand, because this study's sort of, we've had some bits of the study that have gone before, kind of looking at the literature and about barriers and facilitators to healthcare and that. So we're kind of trying to keep them informed all the way along, so that they can be kind of knowledgeable and start to think about implementation. So we're very much, I suppose, working with them to do that, and they're already starting to think about how they would roll this out quite quickly if it were shown to be effective. So you're right, we do need to check it's effective, acceptable, feasible, all those things. But if it was found to be so, we're talking to the right people that hopefully it should be rolled out fairly quickly. And like we've said before, some of it isn't fundamentally challenging things to put into place. It's just about trying to get the right people on board to help influence policy to do that. So
to summarize that, is that potentially 2024, 2025 that people might be looking to?
I guess, yeah, I guess so. It may well be that the NHS choose to do some sort of implementation test beds as we go along, but we've got to do some sort of analysis to check that this is something that doesn't cause any harms or any issues to start with before we could even think about that. So it may come up in other areas a little bit sooner, but yeah, I guess probably from 2024 onwards potentially. So
for those hoping for a health check, it could be happening soon, but in research terms soon. And then for Sara, I've got a question about freedom of information requests. So this person is asking, what was the rationale for using freedom of information requests to gather your data, and how well were they received by the organisations you were contacting? And then they've got a bit of a specification on this question. Were any freedom of information requests into individual NHS trusts who provide maternity services? That's very long, so I think we'll go with the first bit first, about like how were the freedom of information requests received, and then were there any sent to individual trusts?
Okay, so there is a formal process for following freedom of information requests, and there are time limits where organisations need to respond in. So it's it's a sort of process-driven thing to do. So I had good responses. The responses came back within time. The reason for doing it, I just wanted to see what information was held, whether information was was stored about numbers and what information was available in terms of things like training courses and those sorts of things. So it just seemed a practical way to do it. So I had good responses, and the responses followed the time processes that need to happen. In terms of asking the individual trusts, I did that as part of my small project before this project, and I approached 4 trusts, and they all responded, and only 2 of them held any data about the numbers I was looking for, and there wasn't any information about anything like training. It was just the numbers about autistic service users that was available to me. So oh yeah.
Thank you for that. Gavin, I've got a long question for you, and I apologise in advance to how I slip up on many of these words. So it's asking, have you considered that the question, how many friends / family members do you feel at ease with to discuss private matters, may be interpreted differently by autistic and non-autistic respondents? So some may find that at ease is a phrase that might be difficult, just because some people may not ever feel at ease with others, and this may be picked up more by autistic participants than non-autistic participants who may potentially disregard the at ease part of the question and respond with the number of people that they actually did share private matters with.
Nope, that's a good. So it's a really good point. So to my knowledge, the social isolation measure has been validated for use in older adults, but as far as I know, it hasn't been validated in autistic populations. And it is obviously quite common for the language used in questionnaires to be interpreted differently by autistic populations. And Sara King gave a really great example of this in her talk on Monday in the mental health session. We did sort of do a follow-up to this study, which was to do with COVID, and we actually have a poster in the poster section of the conference if you want to check that out, by Margaret Leone. And we did find that our autistic populations found disclosing their personal problems quite difficult to family members and friends, and they prefer to sort of do so in sort of a more of a clinical setting. So it could be quite realistic that, you know, that sort of term at ease could be, you know, interpreted slightly differently by, you know, our autistic participants, and but then also it could be that they do prefer to sort of make those sort of disclosures in a more sort of formal environment than sort of with family and friends. But it's definitely worth further investigation into sort of how the language used in these questionnaires can be interpreted by sort of different groups of people.
I think that raises 2 points. The first being that there is a poster part of this conference that is entirely online, and not every talk is within the online sessions, sorry, the video sessions. So definitely do check those out, and that could be accessed from the festival homepage. And also, again, agreeing with Sara King's point from earlier in the conference, that measure development is a whole other thing and a lot of work, and maybe some measures may not be as specific to the group that you want to research as you'd want them to be, but you've got to work with what you've got to an extent. I've got another question for Helen, and this is probably a bit too technical for me to understand because it's asking about behavioural insights. Do you think that having autism health checks attract payments for GP, like the SMI register? I hope you understand what that means, because I don't. Make it easier to roll out.
Well, I guess I guess what they're asking about is around the importance of payments. Obviously, the learning disabilities health check that's run within the UK at the moment does have additional payment to GPs for doing that. That said, not all GPs do still offer the learning disability health check. So I guess payment isn't the only factor that plays into whether GP practices feel able to offer it. But it did come up in our research, certainly within the consultation groups and interviews. It was a factor that particularly health professionals raised about the importance of appropriate funding with it. And that would be funding to kind of not only cover the extra length of the appointment compared to normal GP appointments, but also some of the kind of admin costs around arranging it, and also around kind of implementing the reasonable adjustments and just making sure that the process was given enough time and validity, if you like, to be able to actually put it into place properly. So I think that's really important. But like I said, I think that we are also looking at kind of other factors of implementation, because I think whilst payments hugely important from a health professional point of view, there are obviously other barriers in the way as well that we need to kind of be factoring in to make sure this is offered as readily as it can be.
Perfect. I think that's all of the questions that we have. If there are any further questions that people have, please do get in contact with the researchers. I'd like to, before we all disappear into the internet void, thank everyone for their time today, and the expertise that they shared and the really thoughtful questions that came from our attendees. It really has been quite a joyful session to be a part of, and to see all of the threads come together from the different aspects of research that have been covered today, and that they've just really, oh, this is going to be a terrible metaphor, knitted together to create a wonderful session. And I'll leave it to Bethan to end the session for us. Thank you.